August 26, 1985. Employees at the SEPTA train yard in Frankford, Philadelphia, begin their morning like any other. That is, until they stumble across the body of a woman between the rows of stacked railroad ties. Investigators quickly arrive to find a nightmarish sight that is so horrific and disturbing, it feels like they've stumbled into one of the crime scenes of the infamous Jack the Ripper. The victim is partially dressed, with her blouse open to expose her chest, and her legs positioned in a way meant to further demean her. She's been stabbed 47 times in the chest and head, including a deep slash across her abdomen that reveals her internal organs. There is no doubt that they are dealing with a murder, one that's been carried out by an extremely brutal and vicious killer. The victim is quickly identified as Helen Patent, with her ex-husband Kermit being called to confirm. Though the two were no longer married, they still shared a suburban home, living mostly independent lives, and Kermit explained that it wasn't unusual for Helen to leave without mentioning her plans, having last seen her a week before on August 19th. Despite the extremely violent nature of the crime, however, investigators struggled to find any evidence, any leads, or even any motives. All they had to speculate on was that Helen was a frequent visitor of several bars in the area, which perhaps could have been where she encountered whoever had attacked and murdered her. But the murder of Helen was only the start of the violence that Frankford was about to bear witness to. Because what detectives didn't yet know was that they had just stumbled across the first victim of a serial killer who was about to spend the next 5 years terrorizing the neighborhood. In total, 9 victims would be discovered. All of them were white women who frequented bars along a specific 3-block stretch of Frankford Avenue, between Wakeling and Bridge Streets. And all of them were brutally attacked, stripped, and left in sexually suggestive poses. As a result, their killer would come to be known as The neighborhood of Frankford was once prosperous, but it had fallen into economic decline by the mid-1980s, deteriorating into a hub of crime, addiction, and prostitution. It did, however, have a lively nightlife of bustling bars that drew people in from all over. And it was this collective environment that unknowingly created the perfect hunting ground for a killer. On January 3, 1986, around 4 months after Helen's body was discovered, 68-year-old Anna Carroll was found lying dead in her bedroom, her apartment door having been left wide open. Though she had been stabbed fewer times, 6 in total, the mutilation was just as horrific, with her organs similarly exposed with a deep wound from her breast to her groin, and she was positioned in a similarly suggestive way to Helen. Although the murder occurred a few miles away from where Helen was found, and there were clear similarities between the two crime scenes, investigators didn't immediately treat the cases as connected. Although they did discover that Anna was known to frequent the same bars in Frankfurt as Helen, they didn't find this fact particularly remarkable. Not yet, anyway. One of these bars, located on the 5200 block of Frankfurt Avenue near the train terminal where Helen was discovered, was called the Golden Bar. For over a year, the two murders remained separate open cases with no real leads, and after Anna's murder, there was an eerie silence. That is, until Christmas Day of 1986. On Christmas Day, neighbors discovered 64-year-old Susan Olsheff dead in her Richmond Street apartment, near Frankfurt Avenue, having been stabbed 6 times in the back. Just like the last 2 victims, Susan was a regular at the Golden Bar. But once again, police failed to connect her murder to the previous 2 cases. But then everything changed mere weeks later on January 8, 1987, when a 4th victim was found, and police finally started connecting the dots. Under a fruit and vegetable stand on Pratt Street, just off Frankfurt Avenue and alarmingly close to where Helen was found, the body of 28-year-old Jean Durkin was discovered by a restaurant worker. Having lived on the streets for a number of years, Jean was known to frequently sleep in the doorway of an abandoned bakery just down the block from the Golden Bar. Once again, the crime scene was nightmarish, showing signs of unparalleled violence. A nearby fence and truck were both covered in blood, with Jean having been stabbed 74 times in the chest, back, and buttocks. Her body had been left partially nude, with her legs spread, and signs that she had been sexually assaulted. It seemed extremely clear to the press that the city was dealing with a serial killer, and the media began to demand action from the police who had so far seemingly made no progress at all in any of the investigations. Finally realizing the cases were likely connected, the police set up a task force to investigate the serial killer the press had begun to call the Frankford Slasher. With the Golden Bar being a direct connection to all 4 victims, investigators spent hours questioning a bartender who told them he had seen all 4 victims in the bar, including Jean, who frequently came inside throughout the winter months to stay warm. The bartender told them that Susan Olszef and Anna Carroll had both definitely been in the bar in the days before their murders, though he couldn't offer any specific dates or times. He did, however, suspect that the murderer might be a regular customer as a result. Police questioned various regulars of the bar, but didn't uncover anything of interest. The more they looked into Jean, the more apparent it became that she would not have been an easy target for the killer. In one notable incident in the recent past, 6 police officers had attempted to arrest her, but she resisted so fiercely that they had to let her go. This led investigators to think that her killer may have been someone she knew, using charm rather than physical strength to overpower her. Similarly, it had been suggested that Helen, the first victim, would never have wandered off to the train tracks with a stranger, perhaps implying that she too had known or at least felt comfortable with her attacker. Police did follow a lead involving another woman called Michelle Daner, who had argued over a blanket with Jean the night before her murder, but ultimately found nothing connecting her to the crime. Towards the end of January, a crowd from the neighborhood gathered at the train station, holding candles in memory of the 4 victims. Despite the similarities in the murders, police were still not 100% certain the cases were actually connected, especially when no more victims were discovered matching the same pattern. However, any doubts they had would soon be laid to rest, as the Frankford Slasher was far from finished with his murder spree. A couple of weeks later, the frozen and partially clothed body of Catherine M. Jones, 29, was discovered. However, she had not been stabbed. She had been bludgeoned to death, with her skull having been crushed and her jaw having been broken. At the time, this case was seen as unrelated to the previous 4 murders, but it would later be suspected of being the 5th of the Frankford Slasher's crimes. After this, no further victims of the slasher were discovered, at least not until nearly 2 years later in November 1988. In the meantime, a number of other shocking murder cases unfolded in the area that initially led authorities to thinking they may have found a suspect. For example, Gary Heidnik was arrested in April 1987 after a woman escaped from his house claiming he had held her captive alongside other women. This led police to raid his home, where they discovered 3 half-dead women he had been keeping as sex slaves. After his arrest, he admitted to eating pieces of his victims and feeding the remains to his other captives. Not long after that, in August, Harrison Graham was evicted from his apartment only a mile away from Heidnik's home due to foul odors. Upon investigating, police discovered the decomposing bodies of 6 women, alongside the remains of a 7th. Graham initially tried to claim the bodies were there when he moved in, but later confessed to strangling the 7 women during sex. Bizarrely, it appears these 2 serial killers, who despite their similar crimes and actions appear to have had no connection to one another, were operating entirely separately at the same time as the Frankford Slasher in the exact same area. Because even if anyone suspected either of these men were actually the slasher, they were both in prison by the time he finally struck again. On November 11, 1988, residents of an apartment building on Penn Street, close to where Jean's body had been discovered, stumbled upon a horrific scene in the building's foyer. The body of 66-year-old Margaret Vaughn. Having been evicted from the same apartment building the same day after failing to pay her rent, Margaret was found having been stabbed 29 times and suffering a similarly grotesque fate to the previous victims, leading police to believe that the slasher had returned. But unlike the previous murders, this time a witness came forward claiming to have seen Margaret the night before she was killed. A barmaid saw Margaret drinking at her bar with a round-faced Caucasian man who wore glasses and walked with a limp. So police quickly put a sketch together, widely circulating it in the hopes that someone would recognize the man. Although they received numerous tips, none led to a viable suspect. Many calls they received were from elderly women suspecting their bus drivers, or from disgruntled neighbors pointing fingers at someone they didn't like. Some psychics also offered unhelpful advice, and one tip even suggested witchcraft might be involved. Although there was genuinely a cult practicing near a local park, this lead was ultimately dismissed. Authorities also had a lead on a suspect, a middle-aged white man, identified as a minister who worked in the area. However, he vanished during the investigation and was never heard from again. Ultimately, as with all the previous murders, no real evidence was discovered, and the investigation quickly hit a dead end. Then, on January 19, 1989, a few blocks away on Arrett Street, Teresa Sciortino, 30, was found stabbed 25 times in her apartment. An outpatient undergoing mental health care after years spent in psychiatric institutions, she was discovered nude, wearing only white socks, lying face up in a pool of blood in her kitchen. She had been violated with a piece of wood before she was stabbed and slashed across her arms, chest, and face. The killer left the bloodied piece of wood leaning against the sink, and even left a bloody shoe print this time. There was blood all over the apartment, indicating to detectives that an intense struggle between her and her attacker had taken place. Teresa was known to frequent the bars on Frankford Avenue, where she often entertained male companions. One of her neighbors recalled seeing her with a middle-aged white man at the Jolly Post Tavern the night before she was found, and shortly after another neighbor claimed to have heard a struggle in the apartment that same night. Because the murder took place so long after the last kill linked to the slasher, medical examiner Dr. Hoyer initially dismissed arguments that a serial killer was responsible, claiming serial killers typically strike more frequently, often within weeks. Despite this, police couldn't help but note the similarities between the victims. They were all white. They frequented the same bars in the same area. They had been violently assaulted, stabbed numerous times, and there was little to no evidence left at the scene. Police interviewed multiple patrons and employees of the bars the various victims had been seen in, but no substantial leads were uncovered. They even searched nearby sewers and trash bins, hoping to find a discarded murder weapon. But again, they found nothing. They did investigate a man who wore shoes similar to the print found at the scene who knew the victim, with some reports claiming he was her boyfriend, but they were unable to link him to the crime. Despite increased patrols and plainclothes officers observing women entering and leaving local bars, authorities failed to identify a solid suspect. By this point, they had already investigated over 50 men and had 2 under surveillance, with leads on a third. Yet the lack of a clear pattern in the killings made their investigation difficult. Investigators were baffled. How could someone commit such brutal, bloody murders yet leave behind no trace of evidence, or never be seen presumably covered in blood? Suspects were arrested and released, theories proposed and disproven, but no answers emerged. More than a year passed before the slasher struck again on April 29, 1990, when a patrol officer stumbled across the body of 46-year-old Carol Dowd in an alley behind Newman's Seafood in Frankford Avenue. Carol had been brutally mutilated, having been stabbed 36 times in the face, neck, chest, and back, and her face had been badly bludgeoned. Defensive wounds on her hands suggested she had fought back. Like some of the other victims, her stomach had been slashed open, spilling out her intestines. Though this time the slasher had also removed her left nipple. Once again, her body was left positioned in a provocative manner. Her clothing and purse was discovered nearby in an alley, with nothing appearing to have been stolen. Because the patrol officer had previously been in the area investigating a burglary, it was estimated that Carol had been killed sometime between midnight and around 2 in the morning. Witnesses came forward claiming to have seen Carol with an older white man just hours before her body was found, matching the description of the suspect seen with the previous victims. Carol had a long history of mental health issues, having been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and spending time institutionalized. She had then struggled after being assaulted not long after her release. Though most recently she had been living in a community facility, where she had appeared to be happy and content. It seemed apparent that the killer was targeting particularly vulnerable women, almost all of whom suffered with mental health or addiction issues. The police were confident that Carol's killer was the slasher due to the similarities in the murder, despite the significant time that had passed since their last suspected attack. The crime also bore similarities to the murder of Catherine, leading police to suspect she was also a victim of the slasher, theorizing that the killer was perhaps following his victims once they left local bars where he would abduct and assault them, led police to question employees of the nearby fish market, leading to a potential breakthrough in the case. Leonard Christopher, an African-American employee at the fish market who lived nearby, had previously commented on the crimes, calling the alley a prostitute's paradise and a hotspot for drug activity. Having known Carol, when questioned by police, Leonard volunteered that he had also known one of the previous victims, Margaret Vaughn, raising their suspicions. Being familiar with the area and at least 2 of the victims raised red flags for the investigators, especially when he gave them inconsistent details about his whereabouts the night of the murder. He initially told them he had been with his girlfriend, but when questioned she contradicted him by telling them that she had been at home alone. Despite every sighting of every victim describing an older white man with them prior to their deaths, this discrepancy in Leonard's story led police to take him in for further questioning. And then an individual came forward claiming to have seen Leonard with Carol at a nearby bar the night she was killed, and 2 sex workers reported that they had seen him at Newman's around the time of Carol's murder, with one claiming that he was carrying a knife. Had the police finally found the Frankford Slasher? Searching Leonard's apartment, police discovered a bloodstain on a pair of trousers, but at the time it was too small to be tested and linked to the crime. With all of his co-workers vouching for his character and defending him, they explained to police that the tiny speck of blood they found was from a previous burglary in the alley which Leonard had been ordered to clean up by their boss. Regardless, police formally arrested him on May 5th and charged him with robbery, abuse of a corpse, murder, and possession of an instrument of crime. They also denied him bail. On June 20th, it was announced that Leonard would stand trial for the murder of Carol Dowd, with the evidence against him being considered sufficient. However, this evidence was entirely circumstantial, and mostly centered on the two sex workers who claimed to have seen him that night around the time of the attack. One of these women, Emma Lee, stated that she saw him enter the alley where Carol was killed at around 1 a.m., before hearing a woman scream. However, she left with a man in a car shortly after, so didn't witness anything else. The second woman, Linda Washington, claimed she saw Leonard leave the alley with his shirt over his arm and a knife in a sheath hanging by his waist. Leonard's defense attorney tried to argue that the witnesses were unreliable and that some of the timings in their stories contradicted one another. He also argued that the robbery charge made no sense regardless, as there was money still in Carol's purse which more than likely had simply been dropped when she was attacked. Regardless of how lacking their case was against him, his arrest did finally bring a sense of relief to the community. But any assumptions that they were now safe were quickly dashed when another victim was discovered on September 6th, while Leonard was still in jail. Michelle Daner, 30, the same woman who had briefly been suspected in the murder of Jean Durkin after arguing with her over a blanket, was found dead in her apartment near Frankford Avenue, having been stabbed 23 times in the chest and stomach. Near to where Carol had been killed, and on the exact same street Teresa was murdered, it seemed clear that she was yet another victim of the same serial killer. Yet the man police claimed to be behind the crimes was sitting behind bars. Like many of the other victims, Michelle suffered from mental health issues and was described as a paranoid loner who was known to act erratically. Like the other victims, she was a regular in many of the bars on Frankford Avenue, and once again, the night before her death, she was seen leaving a bar with an older white man. As you can imagine, her murder raised huge doubts about whether police had arrested the right person. Leonard did not match any of the consistent descriptions of the white man who had been seen with most of the victims before they were killed. Investigators knew they were dealing with a serial killer, but their circumstantial evidence only tied him to a single murder. Leonard, by most accounts, was a mild-mannered and well-liked individual with no criminal record or history of violence, and many people came out in his defense, claiming he had been wrongfully arrested by an inept police force who just wanted to close the case, and had consequently allowed the real killer to remain free to strike again. Despite all this, police remained confident that they had the Frankford Slasher in custody, and claimed that Michelle's murder was likely carried out by a copycat killer. With such unsubstantial evidence against Leonard, this feels like a baffling claim to me. Regardless, on November 29, 1990, Leonard stood trial for the murder of Carol. The jury was never informed that another murder had been committed while Leonard was behind bars, and the information was banned from being discussed in the trial, despite police publicly accusing Leonard of being the Frankford Slasher. Assistant District Attorney Judith Rubino painted Leonard as a ruthless murderer, using a Rambo-style knife to kill Carol Dowd in the alley behind the fish market where he worked. While Rubino acknowledged that there were no direct witnesses to the murder, she argued that circumstantial evidence was enough to prove his guilt. Witnesses had seen Leonard in the alley when Carol was murdered, heard a woman scream, and later saw him carrying a knife, and blood-stained clothing was found at his house. Rubino also pointed to Leonard's lies about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, and other suspicious statements he had made. In his defense, attorney Jack McMahon suggested that the pressure to solve the case had led the police to make a hasty arrest, potentially mistaking the evidence. Despite objections from the prosecution, he argued that there were 6 earlier murders in the area that all pointed to a serial killer, yet his client was only being accused of one of them. Many of the witnesses, he pointed out, were known to be prostitutes and drug users, with extensive criminal records and multiple aliases. One key witness, Emma Lee, had even admitted to lying to the police twice. McMahon also highlighted that when Leonard was arrested, there were no signs of injury on him, and that there was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene. No murder weapon had been found. No Rambo knife had surfaced. He urged the jury to question whether there was any real reason to view Leonard as a murderer. Rubino countered McMahon's defense by pointing out some unsettling details that make the whole situation a lot murkier. The morning after Carol's murder, Leonard had casually told his boss, Jasa Fang, that a white woman around 45 years old had been killed in the alley, even though the police had not released that information at the time. Rubino also highlighted a strange remark Christopher had made to Fang just days after the murder, stating, "Maybe I killed her." Though he quickly backpedaled, Fang remembered it vividly. She recalled how he had even mimicked the motion of gutting someone while describing the crime. He also claimed to have seen a white man matching the previous descriptions on the street at 1 a.m., but no other witnesses emerged to back him up. Fang testified that Leonard had been unusually anxious and rambling when he spoke to her about the murder. He claimed to be unable to sleep because he had witnessed it and feared that the white man who knew he had seen the crime might be trying to kill him. Leonard said the man might break into his apartment and hide in his closet. For physical evidence, the prosecution pointed to the tiny bloodstain found in Leonard's home, though admitted it was too small to be conclusively tested. DNA testing was still an emerging field at the time, and the technology wasn't able to analyze such minute traces. However, a blood-stained tissue was found near the building where Leonard lived, and it was identified as type O, the same blood type as Carol's. Leonard, however, had told police that while visiting his girlfriend's apartment, he had seen a well-dressed white man in his 40s outside, wiping his hands on a tissue. The problem was, Leonard hadn't been at his girlfriend's apartment that night, according to her. The trial wrapped up quickly, with closing arguments on December 11th in which the defense stressed Leonard's good character and the lack of a motive, weapon, or solid evidence tying him to the murder, or any of the linked murders. He pointed out that the description of the white man Leonard had given matched earlier witness reports of men seen with all the other victims. McMahon called the prosecution's case garbage, emphasizing that the violence Leonard was accused of was entirely out of character for him. Rubino, however, asked the jury to consider why the witnesses would lie, noting that some were friends of Leonard's, including one who had admitted to originally lying on his behalf to the police. Rubino also pointed out the testimony of witnesses who claimed to have seen Leonard with Carol in a bar the night she was killed, as well as the fact that his girlfriend testified that she did not see him that night, contradicting his claims. On the following day, December 12th, the jury returned a guilty verdict, convicting Leonard of first-degree murder in the death of Carol Dowd. Some jurors, it was reported, appeared visibly shaken by the verdict. Leonard showed no reaction to the verdict, but his defense attorney shook his head in disbelief. While the prosecutor had requested the death penalty, Leonard was instead sentenced to life in prison. He maintained that he had been framed by what he called pipers, prostitutes manipulated by the police. Aside from his strange comment to Fang, he had never confessed to the crime at any other point, and never did even after his conviction. To the majority of investigators nowadays, it seems clear as day that Leonard was not the Frankford Slasher, with police even conceding that while they think he killed Carol, they do not think he killed the other 8 women. Believing he was wrongly convicted in the murder of Carol, the Innocence Project picked up his case, but before they could offer him any real assistance, Leonard sadly died of cancer in prison. So was Leonard Christopher truly the Frankford Slasher, or was he wrongly accused? Even after he was in custody, another body was discovered, yet somehow he wasn't released and cleared of involvement, and the crime was dismissed as a copycat killing for no real reason. Many believe his conviction was driven by racial bias, with the media's sensationalized coverage fueling public pressure to resolve the case quickly. The verdict seemed more about appeasing the public than about true justice. As it stands, the Frankford Slasher case is considered unsolved, even with the conviction of Leonard for Carol's murder. Leonard officially remains a suspect in the other 8 murders, but nearly 30 years later, he has never been tied to any of them, and no solid evidence linking him to the murder of Carol has ever been uncovered. While Leonard's statements to his boss are somewhat compelling evidence against him, it doesn't change the fact that he does not match the suspects seen with nearly every one of the victims prior to their murders, and that there is no direct evidence linking him to the slasher's crimes. No motive, no murder weapon, no DNA, nothing. While it is possible that a copycat was responsible for the murder that occurred while Leonard was in prison, or that not all of the murders are actually connected, it's equally possible that they were all committed by the same individual, and consequently that individual cannot have been Leonard. No new evidence has ever emerged to shed light on the cases, but thankfully, no additional victims have surfaced either. While the Frankford Slasher was likely never caught, we can only hope that whoever was responsible is no longer active. Despite nearly 30 years having passed and the case having faded from the headlines, investigators have recently started to finally revisit the case in the hopes that DNA evidence and advanced forensic techniques might be able to crack it. For one, you'd hope the blood sample taken from Leonard's house could finally be tested with modern techniques to prove once and for all if it was or wasn't Carol's blood. Also, if you remember, I mentioned briefly earlier in the video that police had suspected a middle-aged white man who claimed to be a minister, who vanished after being questioned. Before he disappeared, they actually managed to collect a DNA sample from him, which is now being re-examined using cutting-edge technology. But as the case remains an ongoing investigation, police have refused to discuss it and remained tight-lipped on their progress or any new findings. Attorney Marissa Bluestein from the Innocence Project is still investigating the case, despite Leonard's death, stating, "This is a man who spent the majority of his life in a prison cell for a crime that he did not commit." In a way, that bothered him more than the fact that his freedom had been taken away. Not only was Ms. Dowd never given justice because her murderer was never found and caught, but the other 8 women, those murders are still unsolved. In October 2023, Raymond Wexel Jr., 51, while in jail accused of killing his neighbor and stabbing 2 inmates at the Blair County Prison, has claimed responsibility for the 9 murders, making the claim that he was the Frankford Slasher. Whether truthful or not, his claims are currently being investigated by the Philadelphia police. But as far as I'm aware, there have been no new announcements since the initial coverage of the situation back in 2023. It's worth pointing out, Wexler would have been a lot younger at the time than the suspects seen with many of the victims. The victims of the Frankford Slasher are part of a broader pattern where marginalized women are especially vulnerable to violence, including murder, in the United States. Most of the women targeted in this case were known to frequent areas notorious for drug activity, and many were suspected to have drug addictions, with some even potentially being involved in sex work. The truth about the Frankford Slasher may never be known. What is clear is that the case, filled with unanswered questions and lingering doubts, remains a haunting chapter in Philadelphia's history. And with that, our exploration of this disturbing case comes to a close. So what do you think about this one? Do you think the murders were all committed by the same serial killer? Do you think Leonard was guilty of killing Carol, or even all of the victims? Or in contrast, do you think he was wrongfully convicted? Was he racially targeted and used as a scapegoat by law enforcement? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and consider checking out my new Patreon if you want to support me further. You have been watching The Mystery Abyss.